At 40 degrees below zero, the human body ceases to be a living organism and becomes a thermodynamic equation in a state of rapid, violent decay. On a bitter afternoon in the late autumn of 1860, Lieutenant Arthur Pendelton stood on the Macaly rocky, wind-scoured shoreline of Baffin Island and watched his men struggle with the cargo. The gray, leaden sky hung so low it felt as if it were pressing down on the very surface of the freezing ocean, where dark, slushy ice was already beginning to congeal along the black rocks. The wind did not merely blow. It carried a sharp, physical weight, a persistent warning from the high Arctic that winter was arriving early, and it was arriving with an unforgiving fury. For Pendleton and his expedition, survival was a matter of national pride and industrial confidence. They had traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic, carrying the very best materials Victorian engineering could provide. Behind him, on the rocky beach, sat massive wooden crates containing their primary defense against the polar night, a prefabricated, double-walled English pine command cabin. It had been carefully designed in London, complete with tongue-and-groove joinery, heavy wool felt liners to be sandwiched between the double timber walls, and a state-of-the-art cast-iron stove designed to burn high-grade Welsh coal. To Pendleton, this timber cabin was not just a shelter. It was a physical manifestation of empire, a portable fortress built to withstand the most hostile climates on Earth through the sheer power of human ingenuity and imported steel. As his men hauled the heavy pine planks up the rocky slope, Pendleton noticed a silent figure watching them from the crest of a nearby ridge. It was Taktu, an Inuit hunter and builder, wrapped in layers of thick caribou skin that rustled softly in the wind. Taktu stood completely still, his dark eyes observing the frantic, sweat-soaked labor of the European sailors with a quiet, unreadable expression. In the high Arctic, sweat is a death sentence. It dampens clothing, freezes against the skin, and accelerates hypothermia. Yet Pendleton's men, driven by the fear of the darkening sky, worked until their wool shirts were damp with perspiration, their breath freezing into thick crusts of white ice on their collars. Taktu's presence was a silent contrast to their struggle. He stood relaxed, breathing slowly, perfectly balanced in an environment that Pendleton's men were fighting with every ounce of their strength. If you find these stories of survival and forgotten ingenuity inspiring, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring more of these detailed historical reconstructions to life. To Lieutenant Pendleton, the construction of their winter quarters was a disciplined, orderly task that proceeded according to the finest traditions of British building. He stood on the rocky ground, clipboard in hand, directing his men as they assembled the Pine Command cabin. The planks went up quickly, their cushions, precise joints locking together to form a neat, rectangular box that stood proud on the flat, treeless tundra. On the inside, they tacked layers of heavy wool felt to the timber walls, followed by an inner lining of smooth pine boards. In the center of the room, they installed the heavy cast-iron stove, running its long black stovepipe straight up through the roof. It was a handsome, orderly house, a familiar piece of England, standing defiant against the vast, empty gray of the polar landscape. Taktu walked down from the ridge one afternoon, accompanied by a translator, to observe the progress. He walked around the rectangular timber box, running his hand over the smooth vertical pine planks, his face showing a deep, quiet concern. He spoke slowly, pointing to the flat, vertical walls, and then to the vast expanse of the open tundra. He tried to explain to Pendleton that building on the surface was a fundamental mistake. A house that stood high above the ground was a target for the wind, a target that would lose its warmth faster than any stove could replace it. He pointed out that the timber would shrink in the deep cold opening tiny gaps in the joinery, and that when the coal ran out, the wood frame walls would hold no heat. Taktu urged Pendleton to abandon the frame, surface cabin, and help his people construct a semi-subterranean qarmaq, a house built into the earth, using the dense soil and the bones of the sea. Pendleton listened to the translation, but his response was a polite, dismissive smile. To an officer of the Royal Navy, the idea of digging a hole in the dirt and living beneath the ground like an animal was not only absurd, but undignified. He believed implicitly in the active heating capacity of his coal stove and the insulating properties of his double timber walls. To Pendleton, the pine and steel had stood the winters of the North Atlantic, and they would stand the winters here. Taktu nodded quietly, his eyes lingering on the thin, vertical walls of the pine cabin before turning back toward his own camp. He did not argue. He knew that the Arctic did not care about pride, and that winter would deliver its own absolute verdict. To understand why Taktu was so concerned, one must understand the brutal thermodynamics of the high Arctic winter. On the flat, treeless expanse of the blank tundra, there is no friction, nothing to slow the movement of the air. When the cold winds drop out of the polar basin, they accelerate across the empty plains, turning the atmosphere into a giant convective engine. We call the wind the heat thief, because it does not simply blow past a structure, it strips warmth away through forced convection. When a 40-mile-per-hour gale at 40 degrees below zero hits a flat, vertical surface, it removes the thin, insulating, molecular layer of warm air that naturally clings to the outside of the walls, accelerating the rate of heat loss by a factor of 15 or 20. Pendleton's rectangular cabin was a perfect target for this convective engine. Its flat vertical walls stood directly perpendicular to the path of the prevailing northwest winds. When a gust struck the front of the timber house, it created a localized zone of high pressure against the wood planks, forcing cold air through the tiniest microscopic gaps in the shrinkage-cracked timber. Simultaneously, the wind curving around the corners of the rectangular structure created a powerful vacuum at the rear, literally sucking the warm air out from the cabin's interior through the seams. It was a continuous, mechanical drain, a system where the building was constantly fighting an infinite heat sink. The wood frame walls offered thermal resistance, but they had zero thermal weight. The moment the fire in the stove burned low, the interior air temperature would plummet to match the freezing world outside. Taktu's architectural philosophy was the exact opposite. Instead of fighting the plaint wind, the Inuit sought to exit the volatile, convective atmosphere entirely. By moving the foundation of the home 3 feet into the earth, they utilized the massive, stable density of the planet itself. They understood that while the air temperature above the surface could fluctuate wildly, dropping to 50 or 60 below zero in a single night, the temperature of the ground below the active layer remained remarkably stable, hovering near the freezing point of 32 degrees Fahrenheit. The Earth did not just act as a wall, it functioned as a planetary heat reservoir, protecting the structure from direct wind contact and slowing the conduction of energy to the frozen exterior. To Taktu, a home was not a box built on the land, it was a sanctuary carved into the land, a design that used geometry and material density to achieve a state of permanent thermal security. Building a semi-subterranean house in the high Arctic presents a mechanical obstacle that would defeat most modern construction crews. Below the thin, active surface layer of moss and peat lie the permafrost soil, silt, and rock that has been frozen solid for thousands of years. Its compressive strength is comparable to high-grade industrial concrete. Trying to dig into this frozen ground with standard steel shovels or iron picks is an exercise in futility. The tools bounce off the rock-hard silt, dulling their edges and exhausting the workers within minutes. To a modern mind, excavating a 3-foot deep pit in Tao, such conditions seems impossible without heavy machinery. Taktu's people solved this engineering challenge, not through brute force, but through a patient, organized strategy of temporal engineering. They did not attempt to dig through the permafrost. They allowed the sun to do the heavy work for them. During the brief Arctic summer, when the sun remained low but constant, on the horizon, the top few inches of the permafrost would naturally soften into a thick, dark mud. Taktu and his family would carefully scrape this thawed layer away using bone mattocks and stone-bladed shovels, exposing the next layer of frozen ice silt to the direct solar radiation. Day after day, week after week, they returned to the pit, removing the thawed mud, inch by inch, slowly lowering the foundation of their home into the earth. This methodical excavation was a long-term investment in thermal security. By the time autumn arrived and the ground began to refreeze, they had carved out a clean, circular pit ranging from 12 to 20 feet in diameter, sunk 3 feet into the earth. The walls of this pit were not loose dirt. They were solid, stable permafrost, a massive thermal buffer that would never shift or settle. 2. Pendleton's men, who watched the slow, muddy process from their clean wooden deck, the work seemed dirty and primitive. They did not see the engineering, logic at play. They did not understand that Taktu had successfully utilized solar energy to excavate a thermal bunker, creating a foundation that was completely insulated from the sub-zero air currents that would soon scour the surface of the tundra. The second great engineering challenge of the high Arctic is the complete absence of timber. On the tundra, there are no trees to fell for beams, no logs to span a ceiling, no branches to support a roof. To build a permanent, semi-subterranean structure, Taktu had to find a different material to bridge the void above his excavated pit. For this, his people turned to the sea, utilizing the skeletal remains of the largest creature in the polar waters, the bowhead whale. A single bowhead whale can reach 60 feet in length and weigh up to 60 tons, representing an extraordinary resource of organic building materials. The primary rafters of Taktu's dome were the mandibles, the massive jawbones of the whale. These bones are naturally curved, dense, and incredibly strong, capable of reaching lengths of 15 feet and weighing several hundred pounds each. In structural engineering, the arch is a superior geometric form to the flat beam because it converts tensile stress into compressive force, distributing the weight of the roof outward and downward into the surrounding earth. Taktu and his family would haul these giant mandibles up from the shoreline, positioning them around the perimeter of the excavated pit. They leaned the curved bones inward, their tops converging at a central point to form a self-supporting dome that required no internal columns or supports. The ribs of the whale served as the secondary framework, lashed horizontally across the massive mandible arches to create a rigid, cross-lattice structure. This bone lattice functioned exactly like the lath in a modern wall, providing a highly stable substrate for the roof covering. For the finer details of the enclosure, Taktu used the scapulae, the broad, flat shoulder blades of the whale. These bones functioned as natural shingles, placed over the gaps in the rib lattice to create a semi-waterproof layer that prevented loose soil and debris from falling into the living space. Every piece of the skeleton was selected based on its unique geometry and its ability to distribute the immense weight of the earth roof, turning the bones of a sea monster into a permanent, self-supporting fortress. As assembling a structure from massive whale bones requires a joint system that can withstand extreme physical loads and sub-zero temperatures. In traditional, Western construction, joints are held together by rigid fasteners, iron nails, wooden pegs, or steel bolts. But in the deep freeze of an Arctic winter, these rigid materials present serious engineering hazards. Metal conducts cold directly into the structure, creating cold bridges that attract frost, while wood shrinks and splits, loosening the joints. Furthermore, rigid connections can easily fracture under the immense, shifting loads of snow and soil. Taktu's people solved this joinery problem by utilizing baleen, the long, flexible plates of keratin that hang from the upper jaw of the bowhead whale. Baleen is a remarkable natural polymer. It is incredibly strong, flexible, and completely resistant to rot and rust. To prepare the baleen for construction, Taktu's family would soak the plates in boiling water, which softened the keratin fibers and allowed them to be sliced into thin, pliable cords. They used these warm baleen strips to lash the whalebone mandibles and ribs together, wrapping the joints in tight, complex patterns. As the baleen cooled and froze, its physical properties changed. The organic polymer contracted slightly and became rigid, locking the bone frame under immense tension. Unlike hide rope, which stretches when damp and snaps when dry, baleen maintains its structural integrity regardless of humidity levels, creating a flexible, tension-based joint that was functionally superior to metal. The resulting skeleton could flex and settle under the weight of the 2R end, heavy roof without cracking or shifting. Over this bone frame, Taktu laid a windproof membrane of heavy seal hides, followed by a 3-foot-thick blanket of living tundra sod. This was not loose dirt. It was a dense, fibrous mat of moss, peat, and living roots. When installed with the root systems facing inward toward the warmth of the home, the plants remained alive within the thermal buffer, their roots growing and intertwining over the seasons to create a unified, self-repairing, and completely windproof skin. The house was no longer a static, decaying box of pine. It was an organic, biogeodesic dome that worked in perfect harmony with the biological and physical laws of the landscape. With the structure fully sealed and insulated under 3 feet of living sod, the final piece of the thermal equation was the heat source. In a conventional, Western home, heating is an active, high-energy process. It relies on the carting, continuous combustion of large volumes of wood or coal in a high-draft fireplace, a system where 90% of the energy is lost up the chimney as hot gas, requiring a constant input of fuel. In a treeless landscape, this active approach is impossible. Taktu's people had to find a passive, low-energy method of heat retention, a system where every single BTU of energy was captured and preserved. The primary thermal engine of the semi-subterranean house was the qarmaq, a crescent-shaped lamp carved from a single block of soft soapstone. The qarmaq did not burn wood or coal. Its fuel was the solid blubber of seals or whales, placed directly behind the flame along the flat, sloping reservoir of the lamp. To create the wick, Taktu's wife would gather the fine, cotton-like fibers of cotton grass, suputi, or dry peat moss, patting them into a thin, even line along the crescent edge of the stone. The physics of the qarmaq were exceptionally elegant. When the wick was lit, the heat of the flame slowly rendered the adjacent solid blubber into liquid oil, which flowed down the stone slope to feed the wick. It was a self-regulating, passive fuel loop that required no valves, pumps, or mechanical intervention. More importantly, the thermal output of the lamp was perfectly calibrated to the low-volume dome. A resting human body generates approximately 100 watts of metabolic heat, about 340 BTUs per hour. A single qarmaq produces between 100 and 150 watts of clean, radiant heat, about 500 BTUs per hour. In a typical qarmaq housing a family of 5 and running 2 qarmaq lamps, the total heat output was roughly 700 to 800 watts, about 2,500 BTUs per hour. Because the living sod roof provided an extraordinary insulation barrier of R40 or greater, this modest heat load was more than sufficient to warm the interior. The soapstone itself acted as a thermal battery, absorbing the heat of the flame and radiating it back evenly, keeping the temperature at a comfortable 65 degrees Fahrenheit, even when the outside world was a freezing void of 40 below. While the high insulation value of the sod roof and the airtight seal of the town, whalebone frame were excellent for heat retention. They created a potentially lethal engineering paradox. By building a near-perfect barrier against the cold, Taktu's people had created an airtight environment. In a small space where 5 humans were breathing and 2 oil lamps were burning, oxygen was consumed rapidly, while carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and water vapor accumulated. Without proper ventilation, the family would suffocate within hours, yet a standard window or wall vent would allow cold air to pour in, destroying the thermal equilibrium. To solve this ventilation problem without losing their precious heat, the Inuit developed a brilliant fluid dynamics solution: the cold trap, or sinking, entrance tunnel. Instead of entering the home through a door in the wall, visitors accessed the qarmaq through a long, narrow tunnel dug deep into the earth beneath the foundation of the living chamber. This tunnel was typically 15 to 20 feet long, sloping downward from the surface, before rising up through an opening in the floor of the main room. The physics of this sinking tunnel were based on the density of air. Cold air is pulled air, significantly denser and heavier than warm air. In a closed space, the heavy, sub-zero air from the surface naturally sank into the low entrance tunnel, creating a permanent physical barrier, a wall of dense, freezing air that sat, pooled in the trench. This cold pool functioned as an invisible thermodynamic airlock. It blocked the wind from blowing directly into the home and prevented the light, warm air inside the dome from escaping, because the warm air had no mechanical pathway to flow downward against the denser cold air. It was a door made of gravity, physics, requiring no hinges, latches, or seals, yet offering complete protection from the howling Arctic gales. The cold trap tunnel provided a perfect seal against the wind, but it also functioned as the intake engine for their ventilation system. To keep the air fresh and oxygen-rich, Taktu had to establish a controlled, continuous air exchange that worked without draft or heat loss. This was achieved through the Sinde and Host AEDS natural stack effect, the principle that warm air rises and creates a subtle pressure differential within an enclosed space. At the very peak of the whalebone dome, Taktu cut a tiny ventilation hole, often lined with a hollow goose bone or a flap of translucent seal intestine, because the air inside the living chamber was warm and light. It naturally migrated toward this high opening, slowly venting out into the cold atmosphere. As this warm air escaped, it created a slight negative pressure within the room, which pulled fresh air in from the low entrance tunnel to replace it. But here is where the thermodynamic beauty of the system revealed itself. As the raw, sub-zero air from the surface was drawn through the long, narrow entrance tunnel, it did not enter the room as a freezing draft. Instead, it traveled in direct contact with the 32-degree geothermal earth walls of the tunnel. By the time the fresh air rose through the opening in the kitchen floor, it had been preheated by the earth, rising from 40 below zero to near freezing before ever entering the room. This preheated air was then drawn past the low stone Qarmaq lamps, warming further as it circulated through the circular room. It was a continuous, passive ventilation loop that exchanged the air roughly once every 10 hours, keeping the oxygen fresh and the moisture levels low, while maintaining the room's warm temperature. The Thule did not fight the natural movements of fluids and gases. They organized their home to utilize gravity, density, and temperature differentials, turning their shelter into a self-ventilating, energy-efficient machine. On the morning of the 9th of January 1878, the high Arctic winter delivered its ultimate challenge. A massive, slow-moving, low-pressure system stalled over the Lek Polar Basin, funneling a river of Arctic air directly down across Baffin Island. The thermometer outside Lieutenant Pendelton's Pine Command cabin read 43 degrees below zero at dawn, and the wind was rising. By noon, the Gale had reached 55 miles per hour, pushing the convective wind chill to a terrifying 80 degrees below zero. From inside the timber cabin, the sound was deafening. The wind did not merely whistle. It screamed against the flat, vertical pine walls, a relentless, physical force that rattled the heavy timber joints and made the wooden deck beneath Pendelton's boots vibrate. He stood by the cast-iron stove, adding shovel after shovel of Welsh coal to the firebox, but he could feel the warmth escaping. The wind scoured the exterior of the cabin, stripping the heat from the pine planks faster than the fire could replace it. Through the double pane windows, Pendleton watched the horizontal sheets of snow flying past, completely obscuring the ridge where Taktu's camp lay. The convective drain on the pine cabin was relentless. On the windward side, high pressure of the gale forced freezing air through the tiniest shrinkage, cracks that had opened in the timber over the autumn. On the leeward side, vacuum effect literally sucked the warm air out from the room's interior through the floorboards and baseboards. Despite the roaring fire in the stove, the rate not of the freighted temperature near the north wall of the cabin dropped to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Water froze in the bucket just 10 feet from the hearth. Pendleton's men huddled near the cast-iron stove, wrapped in their heavy wool coats and blankets, their breath forming thick, white clouds in the dim room as they realized that their industrial fortress was failing its first real test. By the third day of the storm, the situation inside the English pine cabin had turned from uncomfortable to life-threatening. The extreme, sustained cold had caused creosote, the tar-like byproduct of coal combustion, to freeze inside the cold metal stovepipe where it emerged through the roof. This frozen blockage choked the draft, preventing the combustion gases from escaping. Pendleton woke at midnight to the sound of his men coughing violently in the dark. The cabin was filled with a thick, acrid yellow smoke that stung their eyes and burned their lungs. They had no choice. To avoid suffocation, Pendleton ordered the stove extinguished. They opened the door for brief seconds to vent the smoke, but the 80 below zero wind chill poured in like a physical blow, instantly dropping the interior temperature to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. When they closed the door and began chipping away at the frozen ice soot in the stovepipe, their bare hands stuck to the cold metal, tearing skin. Without the active heat of the Caldas stove, the wood frame walls offered zero defense against the cold. The thermal energy of the room vanished almost instantly, leaving the men shivering in a dark, freezing box. They tried to burn green driftwood they'd gathered from the beach, but the wet timber hissed and sputtered, refusing to catch. Their fingers grew numb, their coordination slowed, and Pendleton could see the early stages of hypothermia taking hold of his younger sailors. Their active heating system had suffered a complete mechanical failure, and their surface-built cabin had become a freezing, soot-filled trap. In that moment of deep freeze, Pendleton looked out through the frosted window pane toward the white storm and realized that their Victorian confidence, their imported pine, and their Welsh coal were completely useless against the absolute power of the Arctic winter. The rescue came not from their technology, but from Taktu. On the morning of the Taktu day, fourth day, the low wooden door of the pine cabin creaked open, and Taktu stepped inside, completely unbothered by the storm. His caribou skin clothing was clean and dry, his face relaxed, and his eyes bright. He took one look at the shivering, soot-stained Englishmen huddled in their blankets and gestured for them to follow him. Pendleton and his 5 surviving men roped themselves together, stepping out into the white fury of the gale. The wind knocked them sideways, the horizontal, snow blinding them as Taktu guided them across the short, terrifying distance to his home. They reached the mound of tundra sod, and Taktu pointed to a low opening in the snow, the external mouth of the cold trap tunnel. One by one, the Englishmen descended, crawling on their hands and knees through the dark, cold corridor. As they crawled, Pendleton felt the air change. The screaming of the wind grew, faint, replaced by a deep, dead silence. The air in the tunnel was cold, but it was still. They reached the end of the corridor and climbed up through the opening in the floor, popping up into the main living chamber of the qarmaq. The qarmaq transition was so sudden it felt like stepping into another world. A wave of quiet, dry, 65-degree warmth hit Pendleton's face, thawing his frozen beard instantly. The room was silent, peaceful, and bathed in the soft, golden glow of the stone qarmaq lamps. Lieutenant Arthur Pendelton sat on the raised, willow-covered sleeping platform, inside Taktu's dome, his eyes wide as he took in his surroundings. The thick, living tundra sod roof completely insulated the room from the howling gale. Above, the storm that was currently tearing the shingles off his pine cabin was nothing more than a faint, rhythmic vibration down here. There were no drafts, no cold air currents on the floor, and no smoke. Taktu's family sat relaxed on the platform, working on bone tools and sewing, caribou skins in their light, indoor undergarments. The two stone qarmaq lamps burned steadily along the wall, their crescent flames producing a quiet, radiant heat that the stone and soil walls absorbed and returned to the room. It was a placid blank, scene of absolute, peaceful security, achieved without a single log of wood, without a single pound of coal, and without a single metal nail. As the warmth returned to his hands, Pendleton felt a profound, humbling shift in his perspective. He had traveled across the ocean believing that his culture possessed the absolute peak of human knowledge, and that his prefabricated timber cabin was the only civilized way to live. Yet here, beneath the earth, in a house built from the bones of sea monsters and the soil of the tundra, he had found a level of thermal comfort and safety his active technology could never replicate. The following morning, as the polar storm finally began to lose its fury, Pendleton walked through the circular room, inspecting the joints and the bone frame with a builder's eye. He saw how the curved whalebone arches distributed the load of the heavy sod roof, how the baleen lashings held the joints in a flexible tension grip, and how the cold trap tunnel passively warmed the incoming air. It was not a primitive shelter. It was a highly sophisticated, passive thermodynamic machine, engineered over centuries of trial, error, and survival. He realized that their Victorian strategy had been based on a flaw, the belief that survival required fighting the landscape, importing active energy, and building vertical targets for the wind. Taktu's people had done the opposite. They had listened to the landscape, utilized its density, worked within its physical laws, and built a home that belonged to the Arctic. Before they left to rebuild their cabin's chimney, Pendleton shook Taktu's hand, his face showing a quiet, deep respect. He knew he would return to England, not as a conqueror of the North, but as a student of its oldest wisdom. He had survived the worst winter in living memory, not through the power of his pine and steel, but through the gentle planetary warmth of a semi-subterranean dome. When the polar gale finally died, leaving the Arctic coast buried in a quiet, pristine white, Lieutenant Arthur Pendelton stood on the surface of Baffin Island and looked at his wood-frame cabin. The structure sat warped, its chimney cracked, its interior still a freezing, soot-stained vault. It was a monument to a surface-level arrogance that had nearly cost his men their lives, a design that had chosen to fight the wind rather than respect its power. Beside him, the mound of Taktu's subterranean home was barely visible, seamlessly integrated into the natural contours of the snow. Within that quiet dome of bone and soil, the warmth of the earth had held steady, keeping his men safe through a trial that should have ended in catastrophe. It was a humbling, powerful realization that the most advanced technology is not that which consumes the most fuel, but that which works in the most perfect harmony with the laws of the landscape. Pendleton shook Taktu's hand in a silent, profound gesture of gratitude, knowing he would return to England with a transformed understanding of human shelter. He had arrived believing he was bringing civilization to a frozen wilderness. He left inspired by a deep, ancient wisdom that did not merely survive the Arctic, but engineered a beautiful, peaceful way to belong to it. If you want to explore more stories of lost survival wisdom and the extraordinary history of human architecture, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel.